That's fine. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. We're going to get started on this Radical Feminist Perspectives meeting today, and we're going to be talking. I'm Jo Brew. I'm going to be talking with Holly Lawford-Smith about this book, The Creation, yes, The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. So Gerda Lerner wrote this book in 1986. And she was a feminist historian. She was born in 1920 and in Austria, and she was put in prison by the Nazis and she was in prison for 6 weeks. And really luckily in 1939, she managed to get out to the United States. And her sort of one of the first things she did is she got married and she joined the Communist Party. She was always sort of the left, and she was very active in the Communist Party, and she was an organizer, an activist. And she also came from a very elite, privileged family in Austria and was very well educated. She got caught up in the attacks on the Communist Party in the States, and after losing her job, she and her husband lost their job. They went back to New York and sort of didn't have any work and left the Communist Party. And it was around that time she started moving into thinking more about women's history. And it was only at night, when she was 38, she started to become an academic. And then she developed an academic career working at a range of different universities in the States as a historian. So she worked at a New School for Social Research in New York, Columbia University, and she was in National Organization of Women. So she was this sort of, she moved in 1980 to the University of Wisconsin, where she wrote The Creation of Patriarchy. And her other very significant book, well, there were a range and you'll be able to see them if you look, was The Creation of Feminist Consciousness, 1993. She passed away in 2013 at the age of 92. So that's a bit of the background, so you know who she is. She wrote this fantastic book. So Holly, why do you think this is such a good book, and what would you sort of introduce about it? How would you talk about it?
That was already so cool for me because I didn't know any of those facts, and I often never know anything about the people behind the ideas. I just get really into the ideas, so that's really amazing. Yeah, I really love this book. I think for so many reasons, but maybe one is just like it's quite rare, maybe in philosophy, for books to be that huge. Like it really struck me as such a ambitious, large scope project, right? Like she says early on in the book that it took her 8 years to write it. So I think you mentioned it came out in 86. She must have started writing in the late 70s, maybe even earlier. Like what it takes to go meticulously through all of the archaeological evidence. She's got like literary criticism of the Bible in there. She's just got this thousands and thousands of years of like empirical evidence and mythology, and trying to put all that together and understand something about women's situation. I don't know, it just feels like a really momentous, ambitious project. So it's really cool to think about, right?
I agree, and it towards the end of this book, The Creation of Patriarchy by Lerner, she says that Simone de Beauvoir, who'd written her The Second Sex, I think in 1948, had said women have no history, and that's one of our problems. Is there is no history, and it was because we've been written out of history and not much written about us, and we haven't had a voice. We were in this situation of not really being sure what had happened and feeling a bit of a vacuum. And I think in my mind, this is the first book that is historical. It's using the methods of history, looking at what evidence there is, and using thought and the rational processes that are used in history to sort of piece together what evidence there is and what probably happened. And a thing that's great about the book is she explains her methodology. So she'll say, right, I'm going to look now at the transition from humans being nomadic to being agriculturalists and then to being settled. And I'm going to look, she explains that she's going to look at the Fertile Crescent, the sort of Mesopotamia, those sorts of places that are Iraq, Syria, Iran, those areas. So she explains what she's going to do. She focuses on that. Then she summarizes a bit of what's already been written really well. Like, so she talks about the who's written about those things, and then she goes into her analysis.
Yeah, there's a really great, I'm just going to add to what you're saying with this little great quote from very early on. She says, until the most recent past, these historians have been men, and what they have recorded is what men have done and experienced and found significant. They have called this history and claimed universality for it. What women have done and experienced has been left unrecorded, neglected, and ignored in interpretation. It's perfect, right? She's pointing out that like all of this capital H academic history enterprise has just really relegated women to the sidelines or pretty much ignored them. And she's taking this step along with some other women at the time of like undoing that problem, right? The first step in trying to like start creating women's history. Really, really ambitious for its time.
And I think when you start to read it, or you might have read it already, but when I was reading it, I was thinking, I know this already, like she's saying nothing new. You know, I read it a couple of years ago and then I've just been reading it. It's like, what's so great about this? Because I know this already, but the reason we know it is because she read it, she wrote it, and then it's been incorporated into our feminist consciousness and our understanding because she wrote it. So I once I sort of got over my having already heard it from other people who summarize her. I think she's quoted by so many people that then you realize,
it not feeling new. I mean, one thing I thought was really interesting, and I guess that would have been very novel against the stuff prior to her, was her really insisting that there was no single moment, right? So this really important project of looking for the origins or creation of patriarchy, and then previous thinkers seeing that as like the one moment, right? And then looking around, oh, was it agriculture, or was it like the sort of class type explanation of the exploitation of women's reproductive labor to make new workers? Like, what was the key moment? And so she has this innovation of saying that was really throwing me off, looking for the key moment and looking for this economic stuff. And then like it all fell into place when she stopped looking for the economic stuff and she stopped looking for the one, right? And realized it was this huge, long process of getting stronger and stronger and more entrenched. And then she's sort of telling us through the book the key important moments in how patriarchy just got really embedded, right? And we ended up stuck, rather than like, well, agriculture and then domination of women and then we're done.
And the other thing she says is near the beginning of the book, she says that it was helpful for her to not be searching for matriarchy, for the prehistory of a matriarchal society, that a lot of feminists, like she wrote this in 1986, but in the 70s and maybe the 80s, quite a lot of women were looking to uncover the evidence that there were matriarchal societies. And she said that she doesn't really think that that's helpful to do because there isn't very much evidence. It's very difficult to really know. And you get the feeling she doesn't really think there were, but there were more, I think, is it matrilineal and matrifocal, and there were societies before the institution or the invention of the creation of patriarchy. As she says, it sort of was developed as a concept and a method and a system around 4,000 years ago, and it took about 1,000 years so between 2000 BC and 1000 BC, she seems to locate that as the real sort of consolidation of the patriarchal system working really well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, she does sort of, I think her picture of pre-patriarchy is something like gender complementarity, right? So we're supposed to think, and I think there's serious evidence for that now, like that the early hunter-gatherer societies, they had sex, I should say sex, not gender, sorry, sex complementarity in the sense that there were sort of differentiated contributions to the tribe's life. But that there wasn't hierarchy, right? So it wasn't that men were kind of dominant over women, and women made substantial and valued contributions, like contributing, I think she says, about 60% of the ordinary food source. So that's like, it's not matriarchy, but it's something like equality of value. And then we move into this period where the difference becomes domination, or it's translated into domination.
And what she said, which I thought was an interesting concept and very pertinent for us now, is that she is thinking that in, let's say, about 2000 BC, or maybe a bit before that, that there was like a difference based on biology, based on our sexual reproductive capacities, that women would often work together as women and men would often work together. So there were sort of sex roles. And she thought that they sort of were functional, they made sense. So they made sense to everybody, and they made sense to the individuals and to the group. And she sort of said that she thinks that women went along with it, and with this these organization of society, thinking this is her speculation, it made sense, but then after a while it led to gender roles and women's subordination, and that by the time that, this is her argument, that by the time women realized that this segregation, or these roles, were actually going to make life very difficult for women and that they were going to be subordinated, it was too late. And I sort of think that's one of the things that a lot of the people who are going along with transgender ideology at the moment, they're probably thinking, oh, this is freedom because we don't have to have gender roles, that's great. And then it will be too late in 10 or 15 years, or maybe next year, if they might not realize that actually it's a sort of one-way street towards more subordination. And well, she speculated that about, you know, about 3000 BC that was happening.
Should we talk about some of what she thought the key moments were? So
yeah, you go ahead and do that. I'm much more like a sort of magpie going all over the place. So if you
well, just because I thought that some of those were really interesting to me, and because they stand out against some of the like received wisdom prior to the book. So I think maybe one thing that was really interesting was the like initial thing that started it, which I think is her talking about the move from hunter-gatherer tribes to starting to roam and conquer. So these small groups start kind of traveling around, and then when they encounter each other and engage in battle, they murder the men and enslave the women. And so this is, I mean, it's really interesting because this thread of sexual enslavement by rape and then by assimilation into the conquering tribe, that's kind of starting the thread of sexual subordination that takes us right through to today. And I think that kind of lends support for certain theories of women's domination over others, right? Like Catherine McKinnon's, which is really focused on the sexual element. So she has this insight about how, like, a good explanation for that is that it would have taken so much labor power for the conquering tribes to control the men, because the men are going to be of equal strength and furious. So it takes so many more of the conquering men to control the enslaved men, so they murder them. But the women, their spirits can be broken through rape. And then the thought was that their allegiance could be secured, because if they become pregnant by rape, they'll act in the interests of their children and so assimilate into the conquering tribe. So I found that like a really neat explanation of how the stuff might have started, because then you already have a class of people. It's like murder the men, rape and enslave the women, and then you've already got it going where like women are these people who we bring in and we impregnate, and we like that there's already such a focus on the sexual the pregnancy.
And also I thought it was interesting at that moment she said that it was the Bronze Age when that happened, and in the Bronze Age the tools that when they started being, we humans started having agriculture, is we basically the only tool we really had is a sort of club with a bronze head, and we used that in war, or men used that in war, maybe women did, people used that in war, and they also used it in agriculture. So if you enslaved the men and you wanted them to do some work, you would have to give them the same thing that they would use in war to do the agriculture, and it wasn't safe. And so she made a sort of, she wove in that sort of technological moment when it was even more difficult. It was pretty impossible for them to enslave men, because you couldn't bring men back because they didn't really have any way to tie them up or anything. And it was later on that, and the other thing about the interesting bit of it is that she says they discovered, they created the concept of slavery at that moment by enslaving women. And once they'd learned how to do it on women, she says at one stage, there's a couple of 100 years later, there's evidence that then they would start trying it out on men.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a bold claim, right? Because I mean, that's going to seem very unpopular against some of today's politics, where it will, you will almost seem like you're trying to be a usurper if you say the first slaves were women, because slavery is such a concept tied to race, right? But she's again providing ample evidence in this kind of hypothetical, what does the best job of weaving together the empirical evidence that we have, that women are actually the difference there is used as the basis of figuring out subordination, domination relationships, and then they have the template, right? So they can start looking at other kinds of differences between humans and using those differences as the basis for domination, subordination. So the claim that women were the first slaves is actually quite credible on the basis of this evidence, as unpopular as it may be. So second moment, if I'm tracking the moments correctly, I guess, is agriculture, which you've sort of mentioned already. And I think there she's integrating, is it Engels, or at least there's the sort of more familiar theory that like, because you need more laborers, you're going to want more women to produce more children, because then you get the children into labor. So I think that was another moment, right, where it was sort of advantageous in terms of labor power for tribes, especially when there's negative events affecting population growth. So women are seen as like a beneficial thing to have around because they're having children. So that's kind of another interesting moment. I can't remember exactly how many years are in between these steps. I did a little timeline once for a class, but I've lost all sense of that. And then we go into proto-states, right? So instead of the roaming and conquering, we get these like big city-states, and then you get alliances, and you get sort of the kingdoms expanding. And so the treatment of women kind of starts to become proto-state institutionalized. So you get these like very early versions of laws that are starting to kind of regulate women's reproduction or sexuality or their appearance in the public space. So that's like another big, like the institutions and the settlement. So you get this sort of bureaucracy. And she has a story about the patriarchal family being the kind of cell of the bigger organism that is the state. And I think as far as I could make out that claim there, it was something like men are willing to accept their dominance to the king in return for being able to be the kings of their own little families, right? So it's somehow this acceptable trade-off.
And I also found it interesting. What she seemed to be saying is that when we were more nomadic, there were clans, or sort of, there were groups of kinship groups, and people would roam around, and they would have they wouldn't have the nuclear family. They would have groups of men and women, but they did have ties, blood ties to do with families. And that's because everybody knew each other. There were the norms, or the, you know, proto laws, the sort of beginning of behavior and sanction for wrong behavior, were organized in terms of kinship groups. And then as people became settled, and then the state started to develop, so they got larger tribes of, so there was, she talks this, and there's loads of evidence for this in the Old Testament, that she talks about in about chapter 8 or something. There's lots and lots of evidence about how the people moved into larger and larger groups, which became tribes, and then they regulated how people behaved to some extent. So the authority or laws and norms moved from quite a small scale kinship group of maybe 30 people or 20 people up to the tribe level, and it became more hierarchical. And then when you got actually settled states, you started getting this much clearer form of the patriarchal family, which was one that, like the main sort of key unit for institution of patriarchy, and then the whole overall state. So you got those two levels, and it was codified into law. So that's sort of interesting as well, because she's talking about sort of changes in way people live, and where the norms are created, and where the laws are made, and who implements what people are meant to do, who sort of says, right, those are the rules, you need to stick to them. And that she sort of charts, I mean, I guess it was sort of like 2000 BC sort of time, when the settled status around that sort of time of these laws and the state becoming very important, maybe for the 1,000 years around that.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to remember when, I guess it's going to be around that time, because there was also this key point about men exchanging women to shore up these, I mean, so the stand-in wife idea, I guess that's going to be still in feudal times, right? Because the idea is the king sends his daughters into other kingdoms to have like spies and people acting on his behalf. But I think that idea also traced through to the patriarchal family, in the sense of the man marrying off his daughters and the bride prices. And so there was this kind of thread of an idea as well, but I, again, can't quite remember exactly where that's fitting in the timeline.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I've read it is that she uses historical evidence. She starts off very much with the Babylonian laws. So in sort of she talks about well, because there's so much evidence for the various different laws that were instituted in Babylonia, and there are three main types of laws that where are they? I haven't got them. But in those situations, what's really good is she's got loads of evidence for the different way that men and women were regulated, and it's written down. And there's a lot. So in the first humans writing down law, they talked about how people should behave to each other, how men should behave to each other, but there's a huge amount written down about how women should behave, and it's about their sexuality, and it's about how they should behave in terms of what they're allowed to do with their bodies and their reproduction. Like there's massive, well, in some situations, or there's the death penalty for abortion, that women aren't allowed to do abortion, whereas, and it's thought to be a crime against the state, but also against the master, the man. And it's also instituted reasonably quickly that women are not sort of economic actors, that most women are, their status in society is in relation to who they're married to. So they don't have their own inherent status, they have status from their father or from their husband. And there are some sort of exceptions for that. So some very rich women are allowed to own property, but they're not allowed to have sex with anybody they want to. So whereas men in from really the beginning, when they started writing down laws in 2000 BC, men were allowed to have sex with prostitutes or any women, as long as they weren't owned by another man, whereas women were not allowed to do that, and there were massive punishments by the state for that.
Yeah, I mean that I'm glad that you mentioned prostitution, because there was something that I kind of got tripped up by in her explanation. She sort of just seemed to say that it was a product of the fact that men could then do well out of controlling women's sexuality, right? So the father who can ensure his daughter's chastity then has these high value daughters to pass out to men of power and make all these alliances, and right, so women sort of being the pawns of men in this way. But she seemed to say that that restriction on women's sexuality meant that prostitution sprang up or got stronger than it was. And I thought that was a really interesting. She does so much work in the book and reading between other people's lines, like in the biblical chapter, that was almost something where she didn't spell out what was between her lines, which is something about the necessity of male sexual desire or use of women. Or it was almost as though, you know, while women are being tightly controlled, or the good women are being tightly controlled, so where's male sexual, like, where's men getting off going to come from? Well, there's going to have to then be prostitution. And I don't know, maybe that's totally fair, but I also wondered about that assumption.
Yeah, I think also I noticed that she made the assumption that she seemed to make the assumption that she thought that women generally would want to have a lot of sex with men, and she sort of criticized a sort of prudish, she said, a sort of prudish Victorian attitude amongst some feminists that women might want to actually be virgins and not have sex with men. I don't know. I mean, I noted that when I was reading it, thinking, oh, okay, she's assuming that sort of 60s free sex women want to have, you know, they want that same form of sex that men want. But I don't think that comes, I mean, it doesn't seem to be a massive deal in terms of her analysis, I did notice that seems to be but later on, towards the end of the book, once she's described the sort of creation of patriarchy and gone through it, she talks about alternatives and ways forward, and she does talk about women only lesbians, women not wanting to or choosing not to, or managing not to be in patriarchal families and loving other women, and she talks about the benefits of that. And so I think it might be that she had some attitudes in herself, but she also was noticing what was going on in the women's movement.
Yeah. I mean, that would make sense, right? It would be surprising if we never saw a reflection of the current values. Even if you can get outside the orthodox, you're still going to be in some sense embedded in your heterodox group's way of thinking, and you're talking to other academics and other people in the movement.
Yeah, I mean, actually, well, I mean, I can see in the chat, Sheila Jeffries has said, back in the day, I did not see Gerda as being a rad femme. It makes sense then that her analysis of sexuality is not necessarily rad femme. And she says also, yes, I noticed this apparent acceptance of the male sex right. And possibly even not, sort of that she actually agreed with it, sort of acceptance and agreeing, and not, she hadn't really sort of unpicked it. And so that would really influence her analysis, because I mean, one of the interesting things about the famous things about Gerda Lerner is that she said women were actors, women have been actors in history, and we co-created patriarchy. And she says this quite often in the book, that we are agents, and we, although we've been written out of history, we were there, and we were, she doesn't use the word complicit, but we helped, we made decisions that made it possible. She seems to be always bigging up our agency, although she's fantastic at talking about the creation of the structure. But I don't agree that we had that much agency. I think it was much more violence, and that would fit in with what Sheila Jeffries has just said in the chat about her not being a rad femme, or Gerda Lerner. And I think it's a story that she possibly, Gerda Lerner, found that was where she made her peace with the system, was she wanted to encourage women to feel like activists and powerful and empowered. So it's a bit, she's not miles over onto the lib femme position, but she certainly wants us to feel that we're empowered.
Yeah. Can I add a little quote? Because I really liked this bit too. This is on the, you're right, she doesn't say complicity, but I wrote complicity in the margins, right? Because I think that's what it entails. So she says, the system of patriarchy can function only with the cooperation of women. This cooperation is secured by a variety of means: gender indoctrination, educational deprivation, the denial to women of knowledge of their history, the dividing of women, one from the other, by defining respectability and deviance according to women's sexual activities, by restraints and outright coercion, by discrimination in access to economic resources and political power, and by awarding class privileges to conforming women. And I thought that was so interesting in terms of some of the, like, those politics are not just historical, right? Like, that's current ways in which, like, a woman could be complicit, but also not just in their own subordination, but in the failure of or intractability of getting feminism working, right? Because there are these ways that we're pitted against each other, or where we allow ourselves to be divided, or these, like the fault lines we're dealing with today, right? They massively divide women from each other because we're so heated about the disagreements. Like, we know, you know that.
I mean, it's really great. It's really good to read it, because it's one of those books that she mentions at the end Mary Daly, and I think just towards the end we'll move on to what they said. But I found it was one of those books that, as you read it, it stimulated loads and loads and loads of thoughts about, and insights into what's going on now. And one of the times later on in the book, or at some stage, she talks about prostitution, and that as laws became sort of put into place, the states wanted to differentiate between worthy women, good women, worthy of respect in their society, and those not worthy of respect in their society. And that sort of insider, and the women who are going to be okay, accepted, are the ones who were. So, and this was in second millennium BC. They, in these Mesopotamian laws, which were the Codex Hammurabi, the Middle Assyrian laws, and the Hittite laws, and biblical law, the Old Testament. They're the sources that she uses. They differentiate between the married women who are married to one man, and they who are chaste until they get married, so they're virgins till they get married, and then they're faithful to that man. Then they're the worthy women, and then the unworthy women are the ones who are outside that, who are either outside, not owned by a man, or not linked up to a man, or have divorced, or various different ways in which they're outside that. And then apparently, well, she talks about the veiling of women, that the state put loads and loads of laws in the first millennium BC, where the good women, the worthy of respect, wore veils to show that they were owned by a man, or they were married to a man, and they were going to be chaste and linked up to him. So they were sort of were allowed to go outside and be treated reasonably. And the women who weren't, who were prostitutes or slave women who were in forced prostitution, they were not allowed to wear a veil. So everybody knew that they were. And just adding on to that, an interesting thing I think about the way she analyzes it, she said that there are waves of laws, and in some situations, women get more economic power and they're more controlled. Their sexuality is more controlled. And then in other situations, they get less economic power, but their sexuality is less controlled. So it's sort of interesting how it's give and take in terms of the system.
Yeah, I noted that as well, and I thought that was super interesting. I now can't remember what chapter that was, but I think that's when she was talking about Aristotle, maybe, that the Sparta versus Athens vision, right, was something like, do we want to trade off having like more freedom and better democracy with more control of women, or I can't remember which way around it went, but yeah, like really interesting that when people looked around, or maybe that's when men looked around, to be honest, they're going to choose, well, that one gives me more freedom, but the price is women being more tightly controlled or constrained. But that looks like the more appealing society from their point of view. And that, I mean, that also ties into something she said, which I also thought went quite quickly, but was interesting. She had this very quick kind of claim that like, we can't imagine anything we haven't already had as a precedent, right? So that thought would tie in there, like, oh, well, these are the two types of societies, I guess, so I should just pick the one that looks better to me, or I wouldn't want to be in that one. But maybe that's complicated when it gets to the sort of end stuff in the book about what we should be dreaming and imagining and thinking about when it comes to women's liberation, right? Because of course it's not the case that there's ever been a template for what we want our situation to be like in the world, right? And we have to just believe that we can literally imagine, create, theorize, consciousness raise, or whatever, our way into some whole new thing, right? Not with a template and not the choice of two bad things that happen to exist already. So I found that.
Yeah, I didn't agree with that. I agree. She said at one stage that men must have said, she talks, there's a chapter where she talks about symbols and about religion, and she said that one of the ways, or a really key way, that men instituted patriarchy when they were creating patriarchy and they were inventing it, is to change the religious symbolism. And she talked at one stage about a group of men instituting a new idea about I think maybe it was the Greeks in the Odyssey. It's talking about this sort of group of gods, male gods, sitting around chatting, and she said, well, they must have seen some men doing that. That's where they'll have got their ideas from, because you can't think of something if you haven't seen it happen. And which I thought, yes, you can, but yeah, but maybe she talks about, so it actually, that links up to, she talks a lot about religion and about how there were all sorts of different religions, and a lot of them included a respect for women and women's bodies and women's creative ability. And it's the same story. I think we've read loads of books about this, about the destruction of any female symbolism and role models of women as mothers, which sometimes come in as a religious element, and that all disappearing. And she mainly focuses on the Old Testament, on she sort of says it was an invention. The Genesis, where they said, and God breathed, or said, let there be light, and he breathed life into Adam, and then Adam was around, and then woman was part of Adam. And she said that was like a really, really key moment in symbolism, and it was an invention. They invented this idea that men were the creators, and that was the first moment. I mean, that's my reading of what she's saying. She thinks it was then.
I think that's right. And for her, that I think is her last key moment in the entrenchment, right? So she's got all this earlier history, and then she's saying, now we lock it in with monotheism, like the early kind of Judaic, is that how you say it, religion, and ancient Greek philosophy. And these two sets of ideas really kind of are what like solidifies these earlier steps and kind of traps us in patriarchy. And I thought, just like you've been saying, that discussion was kind of amazing in the sense of how much gaslighting was involved in moving from the earlier like fertility worship religions, right, or whatever you should call them, like really kind of serious respect for female creation power and giving birth, and all of these like huge archaeological evidence and statues of these like female forms, like really solid evidence to suggest that that's something to do with celebration of childbirth and kind of life-giving power. And then these narratives, right, that are like, oh, the woman is just the you plow the field and she's just the field with, but it's the seed that's really the important thing. Like all these kind of metaphors and narratives about how the creator really is the male, not the female. I mean, it's literally rewriting the truth and turning it upside down, to kind of turn to replace the goddesses with a single god, and then to make man the superior, powerful, creative force, right? I mean, it's a supremely impressive piece of propaganda, I guess, is what you come away thinking, like Bible.
In the book, the great thing is, because she's a historian, she's using lots of historical evidence, so it's sort of a brilliant source. And generally, she talks about economics, and she was a Marxist, she was a communist, so you can feel that understanding of like she says at one stage the men are defined by their relationship to the means of production, Marxist analysis, whereas women are defined by their relationship to the man that they're owned by or controlled by, and they're defined in a completely different way. Their relationship to society is completely different to the man in their class. She talks a lot about class. She talks about how the women of the richer classes, elite women, experience patriarchy very differently because they're given lots of privileges because they're linked up to the man, a rich man, but that can be taken away from them. So they're sort of all the more keen to be bought into the patriarchy and go along with it. And she's not that explicit about it, but I think that's her sort of, I mean, maybe she is a bit, but she's sort of saying that there are a lot of women who it was worth it because they got a lot of benefits by being attached to a man, a rich man, and they experienced it differently. And then she talks about poorer women and slave women just having absolutely the most horrific experience. So that's sort of really interesting, and she's quite Marxist in that term, but then she puts in all the feminists, the sort of rad femme, or our understanding of the importance of our bodies and how we're exploited on the basis of being women, and that all women have that relationship to society. So she's sort of, there are loads of angles of her analysis which are very good.
Well, I was going to say that again, that it makes it even more impressive, the book as an accomplishment in a sense, right? Because that would have been so heterodox for a communist or for a Marxist, right? Because that's an absolute betrayal of the idea that class is the fundamental unit, or class is fundamental in the sense that they meant class, right, as like primarily economic tiers. She's completely denying that, right? Because she's saying even when you look within any given class grouping, you're going to find sex differences. And then by saying the very first class distinction was actually sex-based, like when we have the first slaves or we have the first domination relationships just over foreigners, right? Because that's the roaming and conquering. That's so heterodox, right? Against what the like, I mean, what they were thinking at the time, and then even what the like Marxist feminists were trying to do coming out of the second wave. Like, I don't know, I guess I'm just trying to say wow, like that, because that is
Yeah.
such a, that's a rad femme move, I would have thought. Like whether she's technically a rad femme or not, that is the move.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is that her first book was a book about Black American Black women in America, and so her first sort of bit of academic study was looking at the position of women, Black women, and she did loads of historical study on that, and she was very respected, and she mentions a lot racism, and she makes a lot of links to slavery, sort of Black slavery. So she's very conscious of that as well, which is really interesting. But you know, she does keep on going on and on about women and women's history, which is great. So the last chapter, Holly, seems to be the second last chapter is about symbols, about religion, that sort of stuff, and the last chapter is her summary, is Gerda Lerner's summary. So if you don't want to read the whole book, read the last chapter, chapter 11, page. If any of you haven't got loads of time, it sort of summarizes. She brings it all together. But what did you notice she was saying in the final chapter?
Oh, well, I guess I was just so taken by the last few pages because they seem to be really, I don't know, very current in the sense of like, I feel like we as rad and gender critical feminists are in like a very difficult position at the moment. It almost feels like we're trying to reinvent real feminism, right? Like we're like what I just said, she's doing the rad fem move against the kind of socialist feminists. I feel like we're doing that now against the intersectional and liberal feminists. It's like feminism has become this global justice, everything nonsense. And we're trying to be like, hey, what about sex cast, right? Like, and what about all these biological and social related to biology issues? And can we just kind of get back on track? And so the stuff she says about being brave and thinking really hugely and imaginatively, I think that's the stuff that stood out to me in the sense of being really important and kind of inspiring. Can I just do there's like a little motivational quote I'm going to say on page 2. So she says, being critical toward our own thought, which is, after all, thought trained in the patriarchal tradition. Finally, it means developing intellectual courage, the courage to stand alone, the courage to reach farther than our grasp, the courage to risk failure. Perhaps the greatest challenge to thinking women is the challenge to move from the desire for safety and approval to the most unfeminine quality of all, that of intellectual arrogance, the supreme hubris which asserts to itself the right to reorder the world, the hubris of the God makers, the hubris of the male system builders. And A, I just love that, but B, it made me laugh because when I read Phyllis Chesler's A Politically Correct Feminist, or whatever it's called, she constantly refers to herself and the other feminists as geniuses. And when I read it, I was like, God, tone it down. Like, you can't just go around calling yourself a genius. That's such a Ricky Gervais style thing to do. But then in the context of this, it's like, no, because no one else was calling them geniuses, right? And there's a sense in which it did take a lot of audacity to be like, no, we belong here and we're doing this big, outrageous thinking and reimagining the world for women. We are. Now I kind of understand it better.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we have a duty to be really confident and to recognize what we're doing, and to sort of say, this is fantastic, we're doing an amazing job, and be bold about big thinking, and because we're, you know, who else is going to do it? So yeah, and it's fantastic her saying that. Right, there's a question in the chat here that says, it's from Antonia Burrows. It says, but didn't women, I think it's for you, Holly, but I suppose I could think it says, but didn't women also fight, i.e. remains of women warriors found in prehistoric graves?
I don't actually remember her talking very much about women warriors. She does talk about high status women, right? When she goes through the tombs, like there's all this evidence of who gets buried with who, and so there's like a lot of very high status women, but I don't remember her talking about evidence of women warriors, which isn't to say there weren't, it's just I don't remember that being much of a focus in the book. I guess the one thing she does talk about is that the narrative of man the hunter-gatherer, man the hunter and woman the gatherer is kind of wrong, because women were hunting smaller game as well as providing sustenance, gathered food. So that's kind of like as though men just go get all the big things and then they're like providing all the meat for the tribe. That's false. Women are providing the sustenance meat and food, but men are giving the like prize stuff that can be traded and used for extra stuff. But that's still, I think that's not quite what the question's asking. And I don't recall that she really talks about that in the book. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think she sees that. I mean, she doesn't really mention it, but I mean, an interesting thing is that another book that I've been reading recently is The Reign of the Phallus by Ava Curls. And in that they have that's about Attica, the a Greek Athenian society, about, I think it's about 200 BC, around that time. And she says that in that there's loads of evidence of the Greeks talking about the Amazons, who were the women who fought back, and how the Greeks beat them. So they're part of the story of the creation of patriarchy, of the justification for patriarchy. And they say, yeah, there are the Greeks, you know, in Athens at that time. They said, yeah, there were women who fought back, and look what happened to them. They all died. So we do recognize that it's possible for women to fight, but we're going to kill them all. And there's loads of images of men violently killing the saying, well, you know, we're not above killing women who fight back, we're going to do it. So, but I agree. I don't think Lerner talks about it.
There was a little surprising mention of the Spartan women being very busy with gymnastics, which I really liked, just given the current discussions around like women in sport and like women's history. Like I know de Beauvoir talks, right, about women not being sufficiently like physical, and that being something that sort of contributes to keeping them down. So I sort of just liked there was this casual, unremarked mention to the busy gymnasts of Sparta.
Yeah, and the Spartans were sort of despised by the Athenians for being weak, you know, like letting women do the sport, and they absolutely weren't. So the Athenians weren't allowed out, the women weren't allowed out, and they weren't allowed to do sport. So they had different ways of instituting it. Sort of when we're thinking about those 4,000 years when patriarchy was created or developed and instituted, it's interesting because there were different models, there were different tryouts, and they maybe tried the Spartan method, which would be good because the women were fitter and able to participate, or the Athenian method, where the women were completely subjugated at home and just basically sort of farmed in many ways, and didn't even have names in Athens in that period. So but it makes you think about now that you could see that if we see this transgenderism as institution of a new form of patriarchy, it's a new way of structuring the patriarchal system, and that they're trying out like they tried out in Syria, or they tried out in Israel or Palestine, or they tried out in Athens and Sparta, different formats and ways that it would work related to the technology that was available at the time. It seems that we can get lots of insights into what's happening now, in terms of we've got loads of new bits of technology and new forms of state control, or what the state wants to be doing, how people want to organize themselves, and they're trying out this transgenderism thing to see if this is going to work well for patriarchy, because it's happening differently in different countries. Well, to some extent, it looks like they're trying to do it the same in every country, doesn't it?
But you mean, yeah, sorry, no, just to clarify, but you mean like everything is a kind of experiment in living, but we're thinking about the experiments that are like going to do backlash against feminism or going to entrench patriarchy successfully. And that's just a helpful frame for thinking about this current like move toward gender identity. It's like an experiment, one of many, and they can see how well it works out in like dismantling feminism or entrenching.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the way Gerda Lerner talks about the different legal systems in different, as they were written down, like the Hittite bits or the Athenians or the Genesis, they had different ways of treating women, and then they probably thought, right, okay, that one really works well for men as a group. And it's economically powerful, or it's adequate, or it gets us what we want, but we can start to understand what it is that they're trying to get. And I think that's happening now. We can see it playing out of different ways, like say in Afghanistan, there's some groups of men who want one form of patriarchy, and then in Canada and there's Ireland, and most of our countries, there are other groups of men who are trying to create or recreate patriarchy. But if we see it as an actual creative process that they're doing, like Gerda Lerner said, I mean, one thing I just quickly want to say at the end is that the answer, according to one of the main answers, is feminist consciousness. So Gerda Lerner thinks that it's very difficult for women to have consciousness because we're in different situations, class situations, and so it is difficult for women to have consciousness, but we can do it. And also that, we've been denied the possibility of making our own history, but it's that's actually probably the most important thing that we can be doing. And then, ironically, it's more and more difficult for us to talk about women because we're not allowed to exclude men from the word woman anymore, and we can't, and also us to control definitions as women being allowed to say stuff. So I think that's really good. And her next book, or another book that she did, is the creation of feminist consciousness, which we're hoping to do in a future webinar, to talk about that, which has loads of historical evidence of women creating consciousness and are having these flashes of our own feminist consciousness. So we've got about 2 minutes. What else do you think, Holly?
I think I might have got through all my thoughts. Just, I love this book. It's huge. It's interesting. I agree with Jo that you can just probably read the chapter 11 and the intro and get a really good sense, because in the intro she's so kind, like almost that she's writing for her students. She's like, here's exactly what I'm going to kind of argue like in each chapter. So you could almost just, it's like cheat sheet. If you get inspired, you can dip into the chapters, but you get a really good sense of what she's doing in the book just from the intro in chapter 11.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so difficult to do this justice, but I think what this series of webinars, we're trying to get to air the ideas and get some thinking going, because it's so important that we don't forget these books and these ideas. We don't just have to do it again. Like we want to get it out there. So we're going to put this on YouTube next, and then we'll share it as widely as possible. And this is just one set of webinars. It looks as if there might be some women in the States and South America doing some more webinars on these feminist consciousness. And Holly, you've been doing the feminist heretics going to carry on?
Yeah, they just they depend on how busy I am. So, and Kate, but we're committed to doing them when we have time.
Yeah, so I put the link last week, and we'll try to keep putting it. But Feminist Heretics is a fantastic series. You can watch all of them. They're really clear and sort of complementary to this. But sort of we're really encouraging lots of women to just carry on and do more of this. We can share all the different sets of webinars that we're doing. There's a limit to how much this one can do, because we're just doing 1 hour a week, but just it seems like a fantastic thing if we do as much as we can and share those ideas and make them sort of living and dynamic. Next week, I've put in the chat that we're going to have Julia Long is going to talk with Jodie Woodward, Nick Nesbitt, and someone else that I can't see, and Rizzolo about Marilyn Fry's separatism. So hopefully you'll be able to come to that. That would be really nice, and we will put that, we'll upload this to YouTube and share it. So I think it's happened again that we haven't possibly answered any of the questions in the chat, but it's so difficult. So yeah, anyway, thank you very much. And Holly, have you got a final thing to say?
No, I don't, but that's been great. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
It's just been fantastic pleasure to chat to you about it, and hopefully I guess everybody here has really enjoyed listening to you, Holly. And Holly's going to be on again in a few weeks doing something else. Is it the
Grace? Yeah, T. Grace Atkinson's Amazon Odyssey, which is so great.
Yeah, so that's going to be fantastic. So what we'll do is try to publicize the books we're going to do, but for the moment we haven't got it together to do that yet. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you next week maybe. Okay, bye.